Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, part 18. In a way, I was fortunate that I kept very busy during the months of July and August, or I would probably have got into more trouble. I really resented the way in which our efforts in communications had been swept aside by Galland, and how he and his cronies still tried to belittle the importance of good radio communications. No doubt, if I had had the time, there would have been another minor revolution by me. Probably producing something cynical like my earlier treatise about the importance of ensigns jumping out of windows. And no doubt that would have had the same consequences as far as my personal dossier went. Back in June, I was very tempted to speak up when the Legion Condor triumphantly returned from Spain. In Berlin, they paraded in front of Hitler, and in Stuttgart they appeared en masse with full military bands to march from the railway station past grandstands filled with the cream of our Württemberger political and military leadership up die Königstraße and ending at the Königsbau. I suppose it would have been okay if the troops that marched were actually from the Legion Condor, but most of our real veterans had opted to stay at home or at base. The bulk of the returning heroes were just ordinary Luftwaffe personnel who'd never been outside Germany. It was all so contrived to exact the last piece of political kudos from the victory in Spain. The whole thing was a sham, a typical Joseph Goebbels Hollywood production. It made me sick. It was as well that my job as navigation officer was keeping me very busy, or I would have got myself into real hot water, but I just didn't have the time. A Heinkel cadet had made an emergency landing on the unfinished stretch of Autobahn near Marbach. The pilot, a Hauptmann, had been increasing his flying hours for his A2 license when he ran out of fuel. He wasn't seriously hurt, but the aircraft had been badly damaged as it hit the embankment of the road. It wasn't airworthy anymore, and we had to dismantle it to remove it from the site. On another occasion, an Me-108 Typhoon had also run out of fuel, but in this case the pilot executed a first-class landing in a field about 80 kilometers away from us. We drove there with fuel, and I had the responsibility of deciding whether it could be flown out by the pilot, a grave responsibility for one so young. He managed it, but the paperwork which these incidents generated was phenomenal, to say the least. I seemed to get the jobs that had very loose job descriptions, and because of this I was constantly the recipient of tasks that other people could clearly say were not theirs. As navigation officer, I had been responsible for the work generated by the emergency landings, and now another little plum dropped onto my desk. The NSFK, the National Socialist Flying Corps, had arranged the 1939 Coastal Flight, which is a civilian flying competition, and it had been arranged for it to pass through Böblingen on the Lek from the North Sea. The letter had been addressed to von Pfeil, and agreement and cooperation had been promised by Lieutenant Fermer, the adjutant, and Lieutenant Gellner of the First Squadron. That was kind of them, but in reality the work fell to me. In all, there would be 50 aircraft, both large and small, landing and taking off, and I was to be responsible for it all. And naturally, if anything went wrong, I would be to blame. As it was, the whole thing went well, but I was getting more than a little fed up with people saying on the one hand that it was okay for me to be responsible for an event like that, or deciding on the spot whether an aircraft was fit to fly, but then taking no notice of the good work that we were doing on communications and dismissing me as the youthful and overenthusiastic communications officer. There was a break from this when we went to the University of Freiburg, which had a small department specializing in aeronautical medicine. We were to undergo some high-altitude simulations which would give us the experience of high-altitude flight whilst helping the staff of the university with their research. During those early days of the war, we were really pushing back the limits of technology. For instance, my aircraft, the Bf-109E, was capable of flying up to and just beyond 10,000 meters. That, by today's standards, is nothing special, but then we felt like we were on the threshold of space without pressurized cabins. Oxygen equipment in those days was very crude and for the most part consisted of a rubber tube which terminated at one end in the mouthpiece and at the other in a fitting for the oxygen cylinder and regulator. The mouthpiece was held in place by our teeth. The orinasal face mask would not be available to us until March of 1940. On the appointed date, we all drove there in our own cars, motoring through the beautiful Black Forest, and the former Legion Condormen drove their fancy sports cars, mostly Adler Triumph. I drove alone with Zeddy, my dog, for company in my DKW. Henrik Waller rode with Kühle. Horst Tietzen, who was still with us then, brought up the rear. At the university we were put into a barrel-shaped pressure chamber, 4 at a time. Then the chamber was sealed and the air inside evacuated as though we were rising in altitude. We were taken up to an equivalent of about 8,000 meters, our metabolism and general health being monitored all of the time. For the purposes of these first experiments, the air mixture remained constant, at the same proportions as we would experience at ground level. The test was focused on the effects of pressure, the oxygen testing was to come next. This was not to train us to be able to resist the problems of oxygen starvation, there's no way of resisting it, but to enable us to recognize the first subtle signs and act before events overtook us. The test was set up in a room where we would sit comfortably but still wear an oxygen mask through which different mixtures of gases could be fed to us. The masks were of the orinasal type that were to be issued to us later on. To help us and the supervising staff to judge our progress at the various altitudes, we were given a simple task to perform: writing consecutive numbers on sheets of paper, first progressing numerically upwards and then counting backwards. This, of course, would have been a child's play under normal conditions, but as the oxygen content of the breathing mixture was reduced, so the problems became apparently more difficult. The main point of the test was for us to begin to feel when the insidious effects of oxygen starvation began, so that we could recognize them and take appropriate remedial action. Therefore, during the test, if we felt that we were beginning to lose concentration or to feel lightheaded, we were to indicate to the supervising officers and doctor that we should go down by showing the thumbs down sign. We all performed the tasks to various levels of success, but in all cases, we were taken to the point where we lost consciousness. As this was done, the doctor would be constantly monitoring our pulse, and as soon as we passed out, the oxygen mixture was enriched and we would struggle back to consciousness. It was curious to observe that my colleagues seemed to react to the rarefied mixture in a very similar way to which they reacted to alcohol. We had been together as a unit for some time now and had from time to time been present at celebrations in the casino and a few private parties. Each of us was, therefore, fairly well aware of how the others would react if well imbibed with drink. Like the individual members of any group, we each reacted in different ways. Some would become softer and more amiable, everyone their friend or the love of their life. Others, myself included in this group, became hostile and aggressive. So, as the level of oxygen was lowered, effectively climbing higher into the rarefied atmosphere, the telltale signs began to emerge. Hinnerkwaller began to laugh and chuckle. Very soon, the complexities of the simple mathematics were too much for him, and he reverted happily to drawing ever larger circles and spirals on his notepad. I, however, concentrated fiercely on the sums. I would not be defeated by this simple law of nature. Soon, I was breaking pencils in my effort to concentrate and prove that I could overcome this phenomenon. Nevertheless, as the signs began to show, I would give the thumbs down and the oxygen level in my mask would be increased, but it wasn't easy. The telltale signs were very subtle, and I could see afterwards that although I had given the right signs, eventually I had, in the interim, made several errors in the simple mathematical progression. It was easy to see how high-flying accidents happened when oxygen failed. Later, when we resumed our normal operational flying, we would not only watch out for ourselves, but would always keep an eye on our fellow pilots in their aircraft. Any strange behavior would be met with an order to take their aircraft down to a safe altitude. Apart from short breaks like this, the work was fairly unremitting. I really found it difficult to find time to see Gretel and even harder to get some flying time in. However, one time when I got the use of a FW Stößer, I took an aerial photograph of Mr. Stefan's beautiful house and also of the ski club's country retreat. The Stefans were impressed with the picture of the ski club and turned their copy into a postcard. Maybe, if it hadn't been for the advent of war, I would have been successful with my idea to fly about the world photographing it from the air. The political situation looked clear to us. There was much discussion in the officers' mess, but not too much wisdom. Our sources of information were a little one-sided. We could listen to the political speeches which had never been more than economical with the truth, or we could read the newspapers, but they were really only another organ of the government. There weren't any independent views to be had other than our own. The general attitude was that sooner or later the politicians would finish their posturing and then it would be up to soldiers like us to sort out what they'd done. There seemed to be little doubt that it would end in a military solution. There were some discussions about the return to us of Danzig and possible solutions to the problems of connecting East Prussia with the rest of the Reich, but the fanciful talk of neutral territory autobahns eventually came to nothing. There was no solution to this, the most vexing of the clauses of the Versailles Diktat. More and more we were receiving news of how the Poles were treating the Germans in Poland. There were interviews in the radio, and if we got the chance to get out to the cinema, there would be newsreel footage of these atrocities. I don't think that there was any question at the time that this was substantially the truth and that we would soon have to go to the assistance of our fellow countrymen. When I had the opportunity to talk with my parents or with Mr. Stefan, Gretel's father, I would take a predictably impatient line. Wouldn't it be worth taking the risk of the military option instead of all this horse trading with Italy, England, France and even Bolshevik Russia? It wasn't only my father who erred on the safe side, saying that once started, a war is not so easily stopped. He spoke of his own experience in the First World War and how difficult it had been to find a reasonable solution to stop the bloodshed. Mr. Stefan, who was involved in the construction of the Westwall on the French border, was also very cautious. Because of the closeness of his work with the government, he had to be very careful in what he said, but his general opinion was that another war would be lost before we had even begun. All that was missing was the death and destruction in between. Although Gretel's father could say little about what he learned in the closed circles of Berlin, it became obvious that things were coming to a head. More and more frequently, he was being called to the capital to report on progress, and it was obvious that he was under pressure to complete by a certain date. This brings us to a point which is worth examining, to see how transport communications have changed. Mr. Stefan was at great pains to evaluate which was going to be to his best advantage to him. To take the night sleeper train to Berlin or to take the daytime flight from Stuttgart. On the train, he could arrive refreshed by a night's sleep, but a flight on a Lufthansa Ju-52 would be 2.5 hours of noise and turbulence, not to mention the anxiety of actually flying. When balancing out the two, Mr. Stefan chose to undertake the journey by train, involving 2 nights away rather than the 5-hour return trip by air. Air travel was still something quite extraordinary in Germany, as it was everywhere. On the 23rd of August, the Hitler-Stalin non-aggression treaty was signed, and for a few days it looked like another deal for peace had been struck. But it was confusing and seemed to be a complete reversal of what we had thought was Hitler's policy. At the time, the real enemy of Germany was not thought to be France or England or really even the Poles. It was the Bolsheviks. That was very understandable. Following the First War, the communists had almost run riot in Germany. My own father, when returning from the front, did not get a hero's welcome after years of fighting for his country, but had the badges and insignia torn from his uniform and a beating from a marauding gang of German Bolsheviks. It would become clear that this alliance with Stalin was about when, at Christmas of 1939, Hitler visited our Gruppe. He would make a speech which spelled out how he saw our new allies, and it would also give us an insight into what motivated him and what kind of man he was. But for us, the military, it was better that we turned our attention to the tasks at hand. We would have no influence over this political philandering, and it was better that we demonstrate strength by our state of readiness. In that way, there might still be a chance for peace. And there were sacrifices enough without the necessity of war to produce them. On August the 15th, there had been a horrific flying accident at the military training area at Neuhammer, near the Polish border. I suppose it was a symptom of the times that we didn't hear of this on the radio or see any newsreel at the cinema, but gradually details began to emerge from confidential reports and rumors. The first group of the Stuka Geschwader 76 took off from Cottbus near Berlin for the exercise at Neuhammer. The early weather reports were for a cloud from 2,000 meters to 900 meters above the ground. If this were the case, the squadrons could assemble above the cloud and dive through, with 900 meters being ample for them to identify the target, make any minor corrections and pull out after releasing. It was early morning when the group commander, Hauptmann Siegel, took off, flanked by his adjutant Oberleutnant Eppen to the left and technical officer Oberleutnant Müller to the right. In all, he led 3 squadrons up for the attack, 30 aircraft. The sequence was to be 2 squadron first, followed by 3 squadron, then 1 squadron bringing up the rear. The first 3 aircraft peeled off into the dive, and Siegel anxiously watched the altimeter as the hands wound around, winding off the precious altitude. At something like 100 meters he burst out of the cloud and had to haul back on everything he had to clear the ground. As it was, he ended up flying down a fire break in the forest. Eppen crashed into the trees and Müller's plane burst into a ball of fire. Siegel shouted to his wireless operator in the back to alert the others, but for a few it was too late. The remainder of 2 squadron either didn't hear the message or were too far committed, and one after another they hurtled out of the clouds and into the ground. Most of 3 squadron managed to correct and clear the area as Oberleutnant Dietrich Pelz heard the alarm call and pulled 1 squadron back up through the cloud without casualties. But in a few tragic moments, 13 crew, 26 young airmen had died in a tragic accident. The inquiry, chaired by General Hugo Sperle, didn't find anyone culpable, and the decimated ranks of the group were soon filled with new pilots and new machines from other squadrons so that the wound would heal quicker. But the lesson had to be learned that the weather, at peace or at war, would always be an unpredictable factor. The funerals were quiet and largely unreported affairs, a stark contrast to the victorious return of the Legion Condor. At the beginning of August, together with Major Nussbaum, I had been to Echterdingen, the new airport for Stuttgart. It was a very modern complex, complete with every new facility and convenience. A tarmac runway had been laid, and the whole site had a feeling of being complete, of being purpose-built. This was in contrast to Böblingen, where so much had been bolted on over the years. It was an architect's nightmare with its different hangars and various ages, barracks, weather station, tower, workshops and decrepit hotel. The representatives of LUWAG, the airport handling company, were pleasant to us and friendly enough, but they couldn't hide their disappointment at our arrival. They were fearful that at the last minute they wouldn't assume their planned role as the terminal for flights from Stuttgart to Switzerland, Spain, France and the internal flights for Germany. They could see their new facilities being turned over to the first group of Jagdgeschwader 52 as our base, instead of having their official opening in September. As it was, the opening was to be overtaken by other events, and they only just managed to maintain a small service to Switzerland and Spain. I imagine there was great relief when it became known that we were to transfer to Bonn-Hangela to protect the industrial Ruhr. Apparently, this had been considered a more vulnerable and more important potential target than the Daimler, Mercedes and Bosch works which were located around Stuttgart. The first real indications of war had been apparent for a while. While still at Böblingen around August 25th, just 9 days before the declaration of war on us, we had initiated the necessary military precautions. The reserve soldiers were mobilized and appeared in great numbers, so many in fact that we had to send some home. We, the regulars, were going about the business for which we had trained so long. All the fighters were loaded up to capacity with live ammo and then moved out from the hangars to be dispersed around the airfield, squadron by squadron. Now, our Nachrichtenzug could come into its own and we began to hook up telephone links to the remote dispersals. Our transmitter was rigged up by the tower, the mast rising majestically above it and dominating the transmitting frequencies. Civilian traffic still flew, but it began to look out of place as trenches were dug beside dispersed aircraft and machine guns and light AA guns began to appear. It was all hard work for the squadrons, but a spectacle of great interest to the local population who would line the fence to see our preparations. It may have been their way of verifying that it was all true, that war might just be a few days away. Quite out of the blue, I was instructed to go as advance officer to Bonn-Hangela. Assisted by my batman Hans Steger, we loaded all my belongings into my faithful little DKW and drove off home to Heutigsheim to leave the bulk of my kit there. My radio, movie camera, laundry and spare uniforms all went into the house, and my car was garaged in the barn opposite, which belonged to the vicarage. That was soon done, and with a few words from my mother to be careful, I got back into the staff car, which had followed me, and I was on my way back to Böblingen, ready for early start the next day. Now, I thought I was going to war. All I had with me was a very basic traveling kit, very Spartan indeed. First, we drove on the Autobahn towards Frankfurt, which, north of Heidelberg, was new to me. The driver knew it well and even stopped the car to show me the memorial stone which indicated a spot near Langen where Bernd Rosemeyer was killed attempting a land speed record for cars in January of 1938. We drove on through the beautiful countryside, which was the full bloom of summer. It was hard to believe that we were on the threshold of the abyss. No sooner had we arrived at Bonn-Hangela and made contact with Lieutenant Geller that I was told that the move was off. A change of orders. For the time being, we would stay at Böblingen. Nobody seemed to know why. There were rumors, there were always rumors, that the Italians had intervened and so on, but the result was the same for me, which was a long drive back. This time I stopped off at Heutigsheim and picked up some of my stuff. I had learned that I had been a bit too Spartan in my approach. I suppose I felt a little embarrassed too. After the soldiers' farewells, I was back because someone had changed their mind. A bit of a letdown. Just a day later, the orders were revised and the move was on again. This time I was to move with the complete Nachrichtenzug and set up ready for the arrival of the Gruppe. So our reconnaissance trip was not a waste of time after all. We had identified all the bottlenecks and bad roads, and so the trip, though slower because of the heavy vehicles, was really quite smooth. We even stopped off again at the Rosemeyer Memorial and some other historic sites. At Hangela, we were fully occupied from the outset installing the Gefechtsstand for the Gruppe in a small bus which we had requisitioned. We were so occupied hooking up telephone lines to the public circuit, laying out field telephones for the squadron dispersals and assembling the main transmitters that we didn't realize that general mobilization had been declared. The Wehrmacht was already in Poland before we knew what was happening. The war had started without us. 3 days later, on September the 3rd, France, Britain, Australia and New Zealand declared that a state of war now existed between them and us. Although this monumental step struck fear into the hearts of many, especially the older generation, I rather welcomed it. I reasoned that it had to come sooner or later, so better make it sooner, and the earlier we will be done with it. Either win or die, the ebullient but naive philosophy of youth. I was not yet 21. And there it is, September the 1st, 1939, the beginning of World War II. But there are a lot of other interesting things to talk about in this episode, so let's go step by step. The first is the story of Uli's father, who told of his experience after returning from World War I and being confronted and disrespected by roving bands of communists. So here's a quick little highly compressed lesson of German history for you. As you probably know, the First World War ended on November 11th, 1918, and Germany was forced to take full responsibility for the breakout and all of the consequences of the war. As we know now, this is complete BS, but at the time the Allies made it so. It was then unclear what should happen to Germany. Germany up until that point had been a monarchy, but the Kaiser had abdicated and went into exile. Shortly thereafter, on November the 9th, there had been 2 proclamations of a German republic. One, a republic based on democratic principles, and a few hours later, a so-called Free Socialist Republic. At this point, you had various warring factions fighting over the future of Germany. You had monarchists, nationalists, democrats, centrists, socialists, and communists, all trying to gain the upper hand. Now, this may not sound like it, but it could have gone either way at this point. There was fighting in the streets in most major cities, and Berlin was a battleground between monarchists and communists. In fact, the Weimar Republic, as it is called this way because Berlin at the time was way too dangerous to conduct state business. That's why the constitution was signed in Weimar and not in the capital. The communists at the time were very strong and even managed to convert Bavaria, which is no doubt the most conservative state on German territory, into a communist entity. Now, thankfully, this only lasted for about 2 weeks and then the Communist Party leader was shot to death. But for the entirety of Germany at the time to become communist, just like Russia, it was a really close call. Now, you may catch a slight undertone here of me being critical of communism. Well, I won't go too deep into politics, but I was born in a communist country, and as such, I know what I'm talking about when I say that it is an inhumane, oppressive system that deserves opposition at all costs. Anyway, we also learn about the Neuhammer Stuka Incident. This is an infamous tragedy which cost the lives of 26 pilots and crew in a single day. The formation leader Hauptmann Siegel was exculpated in the event, but surely carried a heavy burden with him for the rest of his life. He died during similar circumstances in 1944 while flying over the battleship Tirpitz, and due to heavy fog he collided with parts of the rigging and crashed, perishing instantly. The entire incident is ironic, since mass casualty events during presentation flights seem to be a regular occurrence in German aviation. For example, the post-war Luftwaffe actually had thought to establish a display squadron of F-104 Starfighters, much like the American Blue Angels. They were supposed to conduct an inaugural display on June the 10th of 1962, and on the day before, all 4 planes took off to conduct a final exercise for their routine. They, too, misjudged the cloud cover and crashed into the ground almost vertically at 500 miles per hour. Everyone died. This actually happened not very far from where I live. And finally, the death of Bernd Rosemeyer. Rosemeyer was a race car driver born in 1909. He was quite successful and became the chief driver of Auto Union, an East German car manufacturer that would later become what is now known as Audi. Auto Union was a chief contender for the land speed record competitions of the 1930s, and they were also the first company to produce a championship-winning mid-engine race car, the Auto Union Type C, which I will put on screen right now. This car produced 520 horsepower from a 6-liter V16 engine. Now, today this doesn't sound like much, but keep in mind, this thing had no seatbelts, drum brakes, and a swing axle with leaf springs. This vehicle was used as a base for a record-breaking car, which was called the Type C Streamline, or later Type R, which stood for Record Attempt Vehicle. It was the first car to break the 400 km per hour barrier on a normal road, which is 250 miles per hour. It was driven by Rosemeyer, who was the first human to break 400 km per hour in a land vehicle on public roads. In 1937, he tried to break an average speed record set by a friend of his, Rudolf Caracciola, just minutes earlier. Caracciola managed to average a speed of 432 km per hour on a stretch of Autobahn near Frankfurt. Rosemeyer took off after being warned of gusting winds. He managed to accelerate to more than 430 km per hour, which is 270 miles per hour, when a gust of wind offset his car, causing him to crash into the divider. The car took off, he was thrown clear into the woods and died. His memorial still stands at the place where he died, next to the A5. So, war were declared, and our friend is at the wrong end of the country. We'll see how it continues in the next episode. Cheers.